But first, while the two leaders are doing plenty of frenetic travel and promising billions in taxpayer funding across the country, it's what they're not talking about that's almost as important as what they are. It's one of the reasons why so many people have turned their backs on the major parties. Labor won't talk about its long-term green left agenda beyond a couple of boutique spending programs, lest it scare voters about its true agenda. And the coalition can't talk much about a fourth term because there's not much in it. And what they have on the table is a lot like Labor's. And Labor, as you know, is a small target. So 5 weeks in, there's no discussion about ending the ban on nuclear power on land, even though both sides now say we can have nuclear power at sea. There's no discussion of the national school curriculum, even though the latest draft released this week looks a touch more academically rigorous, but no less politically correct than earlier versions. And there's no discussion about reforming the Federation, even though the dog's breakfast of divided responsibilities is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get anything done. And without reform that costs taxpayers billions of dollars, we've got waste and duplication between the Commonwealth and the states. And there's certainly no discussion about getting debt and deficit under control, because that would hamper the endless new spending announcements we're seeing in this campaign from both sides. And there's another taboo subject as well, something I've often raised here on the program, and something that I know almost every voter cares about. I'm talking here about immigration. I'm a supporter of immigration. Hard not to be, as almost all of us are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. And make no mistake, just about every person who comes here does so in search of a better life. And there's no doubt that the commitment of immigrants to Australia and to them getting ahead in their new home, with a few rare exceptions, does us all proud. But that doesn't mean that immigration must always increase, or that immigration should continue to be used as a lazy way to pump prime the Australian economy without the structural changes we really need. For the past 2 years, thanks to pandemic-closed borders, immigration has virtually ceased after running at record levels for the past decade. From 2007 until 2020, immigration averaged well over 200,000 new arrivals per annum, double the average of the Howard year. Before COVID, immigration alone was adding a city the size of Canberra to our population every 2 years. And the result was, of course, downward pressure on wages, upward pressure on housing costs, and massive pressure on infrastructure. Because every new arrival needs a job, a home, and ways to get around. It also impacts our schools and our hospitals, given the years and years it takes to plan for extra school places and hospital beds. Now, it's true that despite the immigration pause, house prices have kept rising because of a massive liquidity injection that had to be spent on something. But for the first time in at least a decade, with migration halted, our wages have started to rise because employers couldn't count on lots of new arrivals, mainly foreign students, to fill unskilled jobs in hospitality, cleaning and agriculture. For the past 2 years, as you know, employers have been screaming that they can't get staff, not for high-skill technical jobs, but to wait tables, clean up venues, pick crops, because they're the jobs recent migrants have tended to do, whatever their notional qualifications. And they're the jobs, of course, that so many Australians refuse to do. It's a scandal that we've got nearly 1 million people still on the dole at a time when unskilled or semi-skilled workers have never been in greater demand. But Labor won't talk about bringing back work for the dole because that supposedly blames the victim. And the coalition won't talk about higher wages to get these jobs filled and get people off the dole because that upsets employers and rightly fuels inflation. Apart from a bit of tweaking to get in more nurses or more agricultural workers from the Pacific, no one wants to talk immigration because both sides rely on immigration to fill the jobs Australians would rather not do or not do at current wages, and to provide the economic growth that economic reform should drive rather than just bringing in more people. Even though, as far as you and I being better off, it's GDP per person and not just our nation's total GDP that actually counts. Despite all their talk about dropping immigration back to sensible numbers, the Coalition's March budget flagged immigration swiftly returning up to pre-pandemic levels of 250,000 new people per year. No disagreement there either from Labor. And that's despite the fact that in opinion poll after poll, Liberal, Labor and Greens voters all want a proper plan for our population, with many voters concerned about the size of Australia's migration scheme. Again, not concerned about migration, just the rate of migration and the quality. Not wanting to put our roads, schools, hospitals and welfare safety net under any more pressure than it is for those already here. Now, I'm sorry to say we've almost got to the end of this election campaign and we've squandered yet another chance to have a serious discussion about the kind of country we want to be in the decades ahead. You've got to wonder why, don't you? Politicians want to shut down any discussion about immigration rather than have a proper debate about the numbers and skill types that Australia needs now and into the future. Voters say time and time again they want this debate on population. It's the politicians that don't want it. And if we don't have this sort of debate in an election campaign, my concern is, when do we actually have it?